Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It's been a pretty interesting week in Star Citizen, as always. If you find this info useful or interesting, drop a like and subscribe. We've got Alien Week in full swing, Alpha 4.82 finally making its way to the live servers, more testing happening for Alpha 4.9, and perhaps most interestingly of all, a Squadron 42 event that has suddenly got a lot of people talking. And honestly, that last one could end up being one of the biggest stories of the year. But before we get into that, let's start with what's happening in the live game right now. Alien Week is officially underway, and after what feels like forever, the Gatac Railen has finally arrived. This is one of those ships that's been sitting in concept for so long that I think a lot of people had almost forgotten about it. The Railen was originally sold years ago and has been one of the more anticipated alien ships in the game. Now it's finally here, and from what I've seen so far, people seem pretty happy with how it has turned out. Alongside the Railen, we've also got the new Gatac carrier. It's another interesting addition to the growing Gatac lineup and continues CIG's recent trend of putting a lot more focus on alien manufacturers. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a real effort to make the different races and manufacturers feel more unique, and this year's Alien Week definitely continues that trend. Now, unfortunately, the same can't really be said for Alpha 4.82, the patch launched with a fair few problems. Players were reporting login issues, mission failures, inventory delays, missing items, persistence problems, and general server instability. For some people, it was fine. For others, it was a complete mess. The good news is that things do seem to be improving. Over the last week, CIG has rolled out multiple hotfixes, back-end changes, and service updates aimed at stabilizing the environment. The game isn't perfect by any means, but it does appear to be in a much better place than it was immediately after launch. What I found particularly interesting, though, was the recent Star Citizen Live, where the developers sat down and explained what actually happened, and surprisingly, it wasn't one giant bug. It wasn't one server exploding somewhere, it wasn't one broken feature bringing everything down. Instead, it was a collection of different issues that all happened to hit around the same time. Some of those issues were related to back-end services, some were related to persistence, others were connected to new systems introduced in the patch. Individually, they might not have caused major problems. Together, though, they created exactly the kind of experience players were seeing. One thing the developers talked about was how much data Star Citizen is now dealing with compared to even a few years ago. Think about all the ships, all the cargo, all the personal inventory, all the persistent items, all the abandoned vehicles, and all the player-owned assets scattered around the universe. Every new system that gets added creates more information that has to be tracked and managed. And while that's obviously great for immersion and persistence, it also creates new challenges behind the scenes. The developers admitted that some of their testing and validation systems simply aren't keeping up with the increasing complexity of the game. The plan now is to improve those systems and introduce more automated testing before updates hit the live environment. Whether that completely solves the problem remains to be seen, but at least they seem to have identified some of the weaknesses that caused the 4.8 rollout to go the way it did. Looking forward though, attention is quickly shifting toward Alpha 4.9, and this is where things start getting really interesting. The headline feature for many players is the redesigned Siege of Orison. Now, on the surface, it might just sound like an update to an existing event, but I think the technology behind it is actually the bigger story. The new version is heavily focused on instancing. For those who aren't familiar with the term, instancing basically means groups can be placed into their own dedicated version of an activity rather than sharing the same experience with everybody else. On the server, that might not sound revolutionary at first, but it could have a huge impact on how future content is built. One of the biggest complaints about large events in Star Citizen has always been consistency. Sometimes you arrive and everything works, sometimes you arrive and the event is already finished. Sometimes objectives are broken, sometimes another group has already completed everything before you get there. Instancing could solve a lot of those problems. And more importantly, it opens the door for future mission chains, dungeon-style content, cooperative experiences, and story-driven activities that can be experienced in a much more controlled way. So while Siege of Orison itself is important, I think the technology behind it could end up being the real game changer. Alpha 4.9 is also expected to bring a number of other additions, including the new super heavy combat armor, along with various gameplay improvements and quality of life changes. Reports from Evocati testers have generally been fairly positive so far. Now, as always, it's important to remember that Evocati is a much smaller testing environment than the live servers. Things can change, performance can change, bugs can appear overnight. We've all seen that happen before, but early signs do seem reasonably encouraging. Now, let's move on to what is probably the biggest story this week, Squadron 42, because something quite unusual has happened. Cloud Imperium has started sending invitations out to a select group of community members, long-term backers, and content creators for an event taking place in Manchester this October. According to the invitation, attendees will get a studio tour, spend time with developers, and most importantly, get hands-on with Squadron 42. And that's the bit that immediately caught everyone's attention, because when was the last time we heard those words hands on? Not a trailer, not a vertical slice, not a carefully edited presentation, actually playing the game. That is a pretty significant step. For years, Squadron 42 has mostly existed behind closed doors. We've seen glimpses of it. We've seen demonstrations, we've seen lengthy presentations, but we haven't really seen people outside the company getting direct hands-on access, which is why this event feels different. Now, on its own, that would already be interesting, but the timing makes it even more interesting. As most of you probably know by now, there is no CitizenCon this year. CIG has already confirmed that there won't be a physical CitizenCon, and there won't be a CitizenCon Direct either. That's a pretty major change, because CitizenCon has traditionally been the company's biggest event of the year. It's where major announcements happen, it's where future technology gets shown, it's where the next stage of the project is usually revealed. So naturally, people have been asking the question, if there is no CitizenCon, what replaces it? And now we suddenly have this Squadron 42 event taking place during the exact period many people would normally expect CitizenCon to happen. Does that mean a release date is coming? No, not necessarily. Does it mean Squadron 42 is launching this year? Again, we don't know at the moment. There is absolutely no official confirmation of that. But what it does mean is that October suddenly became very important, because if CIG is preparing to begin a larger marketing push for Squadron 42, this would be a pretty logical place to start. After all, the company has previously stated that Squadron 42 is feature complete and that development is focused on polishing and refining the experience. A hands-on event is exactly the sort of thing you would expect to see as a project moves closer to release. Now, whether that release is 6 months away, 12 months away, or even longer, nobody outside CIG really knows. But I think it's fair to say that this event is one of the strongest signals we've had in quite some time. At the very least, it should give us a much clearer picture of where Squadron 42 actually stands, and honestly, that's something a lot of people have been waiting for. So when you put everything together, the second half of 2026 is shaping up to be pretty important. Alien Week has delivered some long-awaited ships. Alpha 4.82 appears to be stabilizing after a difficult launch. Alpha 4.9 is testing technology that could have major implications for future content. And Squadron 42 is suddenly moving back into the spotlight. Whether all of that translates into a great end to the year remains to be seen, but there is definitely a lot happening right now. And for the first time in a while, it feels like we've got some genuinely interesting milestones coming up over the next few months. As always, let me know what you think. Are you more interested in what's coming with 4.9, or are you keeping a close eye on Squadron 42 and that October event? Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll catch you in the verse.